Welcome, everyone. It's good to see you again. Today, we'll be talking about the American Jewish experience. And since we're in Passover season, I thought I would present to you a few examples of one of the quintessential products of American Judaism. It's called the Maxwell House Haggadah. Now, there are many people for whom this is the canonical Haggadah in their house, and they have old, tattered copies of it. And by the way, this isn't the only version. This is the deluxe edition. This is also the deluxe edition with a somewhat fancier cover. This is also listed as the deluxe edition, compliments of coffees of Maxwell House. And finally, this is the most recent version. They don't even bother calling it the deluxe edition anymore. And the text is largely similar, although the newer version, the fonts are a lot nicer, and they've gender neutralized some of the translations, as opposed to assuming a man is leading the Seder, for example. They've modernized that a bit, but by and large, it's the same text and it follows the traditional outline of the text, but it's brought to you by Maxwell House. Now, why did they do this? It's promotion, it's marketing. It's one of the reasons Hanukkah became a big holiday, because there was competition now from Christmas. And you might ask, well, didn't Jews live among Christians before they came to America? And the answer is yes. They did for hundreds of years, but they didn't care about what was happening around them. You know, the Jews living in the shtetl in Eastern Europe or in the ghettos in Venice didn't care what was happening around Christmas time. And by the way, Christmas wasn't that commercial a holiday either until American capitalism got its mitts on it. But anyways, the point is that Hanukkah was a minor holiday until there was a need felt to compete with what was happening around them at Christmas time. And that's when Hanukkah begins to become elevated. And the American Jewish experience is just one example of this, because it's in America that we are free enough to actually notice what our neighbors are doing and to care what they're doing and to have our kids attend school with their kids and have the gift competition begin. So this was not a concern in generations past. It becomes a concern because of the unique circumstances of the American Jewish experience. Now, there are a number of factors why the American Jewish experience is unique. One of the first reasons why, and we saw this a little bit by opposition in the previous class we had on Jewish nationalism, in Europe, Jews were often thought to be a foreign element. They had not been there forever. They were not natives to the land. They were outsiders. And they also thought of themselves that way to some extent until they had the opportunity to become citizens. And we talked about some of the compromises and changes to Jewish identity that were wrought by the opportunity to become citizens, and then ultimately the rejection of that citizenship with the rise of anti-Semitism and the concurrent rise of Jewish nationalism in response. So in Europe, they were always told they were not natives, they were not local to the land. They could have been there for centuries, but they were still Jews and not Poles and not Germans in the same uncomplicated way. But in America, there were very few natives left, we should say. And certainly in the areas that the Jews moved to, except for those few Eastern European Jews that wound up in Galveston because of some complicated machinations of the American Jewish community, the vast majority of Jews landed and stayed on the East Coast. In fact, the statistics are shocking. If you look in 1966 or so, something like 80% of American Jews lived in the Northeast. And the rest were distributed, a few in the South, some in the Midwest, some in the far West. By 2002, that number had changed tremendously. Only 50% were to be found in the Northeast, with a substantially higher number in the South, especially Florida, but not only Florida. That was about 20%, and then higher numbers in the Midwest and in the far West. That number went up from 3% to 11%. But again, even in as late as 1960, the 1960s, you had 80% of American Jews living in the Northeast. So there were no natives there. That was the heartland of immigration. In fact, we understood ourselves in the original version of the Statue of Liberty as a nation of immigrants. And one particular Jewish advantage was that certainly after World War II, they were also accepted as white. After all, just being accepted as an immigrant didn't guarantee your access to all of the benefits of the dominant groups in society. But being accepted as white, which took time, and there were fits and starts, and there were still Jewish exclusions even into the 1960s, clubs that would not allow Jews or swimming pools that wouldn't allow Jews. That kind of thing did happen. But when it came to federal government programs, when it came to housing laws and so on, Jews began to be accepted as white after World War II. And that opened up the doors to university educations, the GI Bill, all kinds of other advantages to life that they were able to access as fully Americans. And that was something that was very hard for them to get in other countries in the world. But in America, they were able to do that. So that was advantage number one. A second key feature of American Jewish life was that in the United States, we had this concept of the separation of church and state. Now, you have to understand that this is a concept that developed over time. For a long period of American Jewish history, if there were public schools, they had mandatory Bible readings and mandatory clergy time coming into the public school to instruct the kids. And it was only a series of court cases in the 1940s and 50s that managed to get those out of the public school setting. But there were mandatory prayers in school, and that was the norm. Even so, there were plenty of opportunities for Jewish advancement because of this principle of the separation of religion and state. They could go into government service, they could be elected into office, they were fully able to vote. The last state to give in on allowing Jews to vote in state elections was Maryland, which was in 1824, I think. So within 30 or so, 35 years of the Constitution being adopted, you have Jews fully emancipated in every state. They're able to own property, they're able to move, and they're able to petition the government for redress of grievances. They're able to not face the challenges they did in Europe. For example, there was a very famous case in the 19th century called the Mortara case, where a Jewish family had their child taken from their home by the papal guards in Rome because their maid had baptized their baby when it was sick, and they wouldn't allow the child to be raised in a Jewish home where his soul was now in mortal danger. And so they literally came in and kidnapped the child from this Jewish family because they did not have the rights that Catholics did living under papal direct governance in Rome. So you could look up the Edward Mortara case. It's really a shocking experience, but nothing like that could happen in America. Now, again, there were arguments they had to make. During the Civil War, for example, it took a while for the Congress to authorize both Catholic chaplains in the army and also Jewish chaplains in the army. That took some negotiating and lobbying. And there was a famous order by General Grant to expel Jews from some border regions as a class of people, which he apologized for in his presidential campaign some years later. But by and large, Jews could live and be rooted in America, practice their religion freely. And in fact, that free exercise of religion and the rules about no establishment of religion at the federal level were vitally important for Jewish pluralism. In Europe, you had an official governmental system of each church and each religion, specifically even Jews. There was a chief rabbi. There was a chief rabbi even today in France, in England. There's what's called the Gemeinde system in Germany, where you have a central rabbinate that appoints rabbis in local communities. Well, that makes it very hard if you want to change things in Jewish life. If you have an official rabbi that your tax dollars are going towards, if you want to create a reform synagogue that's not the establishment version, you've got to sort of double tax yourself by voluntary dues in addition to what else is going on. Nowadays, the governmental systems are a little bit more open to funding liberal religious institutions, but again, the official synagogues, the official government-supported programs are run through a central rabbinate. In America, there was no chief rabbi. There was no central rabbinic authority. There was one attempt in New York around the turn of the 1900 to establish a kehillah, sort of like you had in Eastern Europe, where they would sort of tax the Jews. They put a tax on kosher meat. It was a total bust and failure because in America, nobody wanted to pay extra taxes for this. They wanted to, if they were voluntarily part of a synagogue, that's fine, but they wanted no sense of mandatory Jewish anything in this country. And what that facilitates, that separation of religion and government, that no establishment of an official Judaism religion, opens up the possibility for denominations, which are actually modeled on Protestant denominations when they're first created, where you have a congregational association and a seminary and a clergy association. They intentionally modeled what they were doing on the Protestant models. But the idea that you could have multiple synagogues in one town of a variety of Judaisms that were coexisting, that you could even have a board of rabbis for the city that would encompass rabbis of a wide variety of perspectives, that you could have a synagogue that decided what it chose to do. It could change its practice. It could choose to mix seating when it didn't do it before. This is all, again, radically new. And a lot of those changes were actually driven from the ground up. One of the earliest Reformed congregations was founded in Charleston, South Carolina, and it was called the Reformed Society of Israelites, which started as a lay initiative. There were no rabbis, almost no rabbis in America in that period, and they didn't want a rabbi to tell them what to do. They wanted to make changes, translate the prayers, edit down the prayer book, change their practice to be more relevant to the younger generation. And so it was a lay-led desire to make the change. It was not a rabbi coming in saying, okay, now we have to fix things. Sometimes the rabbis did lead change. Sometimes the people said, we're going to change whether the rabbi likes it or not. But that's America. You don't like the synagogue, the church you're near, move down the street, start a new one. You're very welcome to do that. That is the freedom of America. And only in America could we have all these Jewish denominations. And the third real advantage to Jews, I alluded to it earlier, is that in America, they had open economic opportunities. If they wanted to start a new business, they didn't have to get permission from a guild. They didn't have to negotiate with the baron or the duke that was in charge. They could open up a shop. If they wanted to go peddle things on their back, there were no limitations on where they could move or where they could stay, or they had to be inside the ghetto walls by nighttime. They had full freedom of movement, full freedom of commerce, and this was a boon to Jewish life. Jews had lived as economic middlemen for many centuries, as we talked about a little bit earlier. And now, in a capitalist economy, without the barriers that had been there before, they thrived like fish in water. It was a real success opportunity for them, especially post-World War II, where the first generation of the mass immigration in the 1880s were working class, working in factories. Their kids often would find professions in sort of lower to middle class white collar jobs. They might have gone from being a peddler to owning a store, or then to a general store, and then from a general store to what we call now the department store. You know, it's not an accident that a lot of those department stores have Jewish names. That was an industry the Jews went into, coming from their peddling background and then growing and growing and growing. Their kids, even if the parents worked in factories or in sweatshop garment labor, they wanted their kids to have a better life and to be literate, and so they emphasized school and education. Their kids often became accountants or pharmacists. Sometimes the next generation could become doctors and lawyers. They really made the move up into white-collar America, into suburban America. And you can see the results now, by the way, if you look at Jewish demographics, something like 25% of American Jews have incomes over, I want to say, $60,000 or $80,000 compared to 8% of the general population. So we definitely have our successes. We have our poor Jews too, of course. But we have been largely successful in America in an economic sense as well, which has also complicated Jewishness too. Because once you move out to diverse suburbs and you send your kids to diverse universities, City College of New York in 1920 was like 90% Jewish. But University of Michigan in 2010 or 2021 is not 90% Jewish. And you send your kids to these wonderful universities where they meet wonderful people who may not happen to be Jewish, and they may fall in love, and they may decide to get married, and that's going to complicate things, as we'll see. It's also an opportunity, as we'll also see. So to understand the history of Jews in America, there are a lot of ways we can tackle this. And I'm going to recommend at the end that on your own, if you're curious to learn some more about this, there's a wonderful museum of American Jewish history that's based in Philadelphia. It's called the National Museum of American Jewish History, NMAJH.org, just the acronym National Museum of American Jewish History. They have a wonderful now online virtual exhibition because, of course, they've been closed for the last year. If you do manage to get to Philadelphia, it should be on your list. And by the way, it's right off the main Independence Mall, where you have the Constitution Center, you've got the Liberty Bell, you've got Independence Hall, the first Congress session, and you've got the National Museum of American Jewish History. So they have wonderful exhibits on all varieties of Jewish life in all different periods. It's really a great museum. And as one comment made, didn't they Jews help start the movie industry? That's exactly the point. It was a new industry, and they were able to get into it. They had to move away from New York because they're the moguls of the old industry. Edison and so on didn't want to necessarily allow them in, but they also found, by the way, in Los Angeles, there's a lot of sunlight. And if they were shooting outdoors in the era before studio lighting, sunlight was helpful. So LA was a big advantage for them. Yes, I mean, there's all kinds of new industries Jews have gone into because they're new and because they see an opportunity there and because they're not tied to old money. They can pursue new possibilities. But a lot of that is later in our story. So we're going to turn back first to the early history of American Jews in the colonial period. And it actually goes back quite a long way before the American Revolution. The first Jews actually arrive in the New World in 1654. And they arrive in a familiar place, except it had a different name. It was called back then New Amsterdam, because it was founded by the Dutch. Later, when it's conquered by the English, they call it New York. But at the time, it was New Amsterdam, and a group of Jewish refugees landed who were actually fleeing from the Inquisition in Brazil. They had been in a Dutch colony called Recife, but the Portuguese had reconquered it. And these converso Jews who had hidden their Jewishness to be outwardly Christian were now in big trouble, because if they had been just Jews the whole time, the Inquisition wouldn't have bothered them. But since they converted and then maintained a secret Jewishness, now they were doubly suspect. And so they had to flee from the Inquisition once the Dutch lost and the Portuguese conquered it. So they fled to another Dutch colony. In this case, it was in New Amsterdam. And when they landed, the Dutch governor of the colony, whose name was Peter Stuyvesant, before he named his, had a high school named after him, was not a fan of having the Jews stay there. In fact, he wrote back to the sponsors of the Dutch East India Company to say, do I have to keep these Jews here? I want to get rid of them. And it turns out there were a number of substantial stockholders in the Dutch East India Company who were Jews. And so they said, let them stay. And so they did. They were initially Sephardic Jews. In fact, the dominant population of American Jews was Sephardic Jews with names like Lopez and Gomez. Again, we don't think of those as Jewish names, but those were the establishment Jewish community. The oldest synagogue in America is the Sephardic and Portuguese synagogue based in New York. It's not the oldest building. The oldest building is in Newport, Rhode Island. That's, I think, number 4 in terms of oldest congregations. No, actually, it's even later than that. It's like number 5, because the oldest ones are first, the New York congregation. Second, there's a congregation in Philadelphia. And the New York and Philadelphia congregations keep arguing over which one is really the oldest, because the New York one stopped its work during the Revolution when New York was occupied by the British. And so the one in Philadelphia says, we're the oldest continuously running synagogue, whereas the New York one claims to be the oldest based on the founding date. And so they can argue back and forth. And the other 2 major oldest ones are in Charleston and Savannah. And you think Charleston and Savannah, I don't think of those as Jewish cities, but they were, because, again, this is the colonial area where settlement is only along the coasts, and Jews were very involved in mercantile trade. They were merchants and ship owners and retailers, and they had contacts internationally, just as it worked in Europe to travel internationally because of their Jewish contacts. So too did it work to travel between the Caribbean and the English colonies. Again, if it was a Dutch colony, they could go to a Dutch colony and be able to get in there and do trading for the English, where the English and the Dutch might not always get along across their borders. Now, I will point out, this does mean they were involved in all the major commerce of the day, which did include slavery. They did own some plantations in some of the Caribbean islands. There were Jewish slave owners in the American South, and there were Jewish slave traders who were involved in the slave business. They did not dominate it, but they were as involved in that as they were in all the other trades of the day. And we have to remember that, just as America was divided by slavery, the Jewish community was too. There were American Jews who were very anti-slavery, and there were Jews in the South who were very pro-slavery. In fact, if you do go to Savannah, which is a wonderful trip, I ran a trip a few years ago, it was great, and you do a Jewish history tour and visit one of those old synagogues that's there, they have a wonderful stained glass depiction of the roots of the synagogue, and one of the pictures there will shock you, but it's a Confederate uniform, because they are very proud of the fact that many of the Jewish sons of South Carolina served in the glorious cause. And that was a sign of their rootedness in their homeland, their adopted homeland. So Jews become very at home in America. Judah Benjamin was Jewish, who was the treasurer of the Confederacy, one other example, although he sort of left his Jewishness behind and his opponents never forgot to remind him that he was Jewish. But it's one of those sort of like Benjamin Disraeli had a similar problem in England, where his father had converted, but people kept calling him Jewish because they didn't like him. So that's how it works for Karl Marx too. There's a wonderful poem by Yehuda Amichai, the Israeli poet, where he says, Karl Marx, a man in the street and a Jew in his grave in the rain, which is a play on the old line that Jews after the Enlightenment should be a man on the street and a Jew in their tent, private identity. So Karl Marx was a man on the street. He wanted to be just a person, but after he died, everybody calls him a Jew. So that's how it works sometimes. So the Jews living in America are very well rooted. They're part of the economic environment, but they're a very, very small part of the population. I mean, they are maybe 0.1, 0.2% of the population of the colonies by the time of the American revolutions. A few thousand Jews are living here. It's not at all a large part of the population. And in fact, the numbers have already begun to shift. By the time of the American Revolution, by the 1770s, already there are as many Ashkenazi Jews of German and Polish background as there are Sephardic Jews. The Sephardic Jews are the establishment. And they've already, by the way, begun to intermarry with American colonial families too, with all the complications that their community presents to that. But the Ashkenazi Jews coming in, speaking German, speaking Yiddish, having a different accent in their Hebrew, having a different ritual for their Jewish practice, they've already started moving in. And this, of course, leads to tensions, because do Ashkenazi Jews really want to join the Sephardic and Portuguese synagogue with their Sephardic and Portuguese rituals? Maybe not. And so now, instead of having a New York synagogue, maybe you have 2 New York synagogues. And once you have 2 New York synagogues, maybe you can have 3 New York synagogues. And maybe it's not just by diversity of origin or language, Jewish language outside of Hebrew. Maybe it's also ideology or geography or ritual. There's all kinds of ways. Or I hate those people over there. Somebody mentioned the old joke about the Jew on the desert island that forms, makes 2 buildings. One is the synagogue he attends. The other is the synagogue that he does not attend. And this is, again, very familiar to the American Jewish experience. Sometimes you have a synagogue because I hate those jerks over there, and I'm going to start my own. And sometimes by the way, you can tell the new synagogues because they have the word either emet, truth, or tzedek, justice, or shalom, peace, as part of the name. So, that sometimes is a clue to the origin story. The other thing is you can read the bylaws and see all the issues they decided to put in the bylaws as the cause of the split. In any case, so this is the early period. And as I mentioned, by the time of the American Revolution, we're already shifting from a Sephardic-dominated American landscape to one that's more balanced Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews. And this tips even more over to the Ashkenazi side, beginning in the middle of the 1800s. And there are a number of factors that make this happen. For one thing, transatlantic travel becomes a lot easier when you have steamships. When you're doing it by sail, it's 2 to 3 months. When you do it by steamship, it's 2 to 3 weeks. It's much more workable. So that accelerates the transition across the ocean. A second thing that happens is there's hope for reformation in Central Europe with the great revolutions of 1848 that ultimately are dashed with the reestablishment of autocratic monarchs. As just one example, Franz Josef, who was that wonderful emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, starts his reign after the turmoil of 1848 in earnest. He's appointed, I think, shortly before, and then runs all the way through 1916. But that only, that's a reestablishment of the traditional autocrats. And the same thing happens in France and in other places after, the Les Mis story we think is wonderful, the revolution, and then they all get shot. And the monarchy is reestablished. So after the disappointments of 1848, a lot of the Enlightenment-minded Jews who were hoping for reformation in Hungary, in parts of Poland and Germany, decide they need to try something else. I'll also point out, by the way, this is also a period where huge numbers of non-Jewish German speakers make their way into America and make their way particularly into river towns like Louisville, Kentucky, Cincinnati, Ohio, Chicago, because rivers were the way to transport goods back then. Before you had the transatlantic railroad, the canal system and the rivers were vitally important to hauling goods. And so port towns on rivers became very important. And also in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois are settled with large numbers of Germans, and German Jews came along with where the Germans were. In fact, I understand that German was one of the most popular foreign languages to be taught in elementary schools until World War I, in part because of this huge numbers of German populations that had moved here. Obviously, World War I changes everything with victory sausage and victory cabbage and all that renaming of stuff, and German goes down in prestige. But many Jews coming in that period were very attached, not to Yiddish, but to German. There were communities that kept the minutes of their board meetings in German into the 1880s and 1890s. Now, the real wave takes off in the 1840s and lasts through about the 1870s. And during this period, you have about 250,000 Jews who are living in America. So if you had maybe 10,000 or 15,000 Jews who were living in America at the time of the revolution, by the 1830s, you've got maybe 40,000 Jews with natural increase. Now you're going up to 250,000 Jews. So you're, quintupling, sextupling the population of Jews. The vast majority of them are coming from Central Europe, although about 1/6 of American Jews in this period are from further east, Poland, and maybe even the Russian Empire by now. But the dominant frame of this period is this German Jewish experience, and particularly the progressive Enlightenment. We can now start using the word Reform Jewish model of a temple, which is called a temple because this is our Jerusalem. We don't need a promised land in Israel. Editing of the texts, mixed gender seating, sermons in English, even a prayer book done in English. Although I'll point out that the first prayer book translation done in America was by a rabbi named David Einhorn, who was a radical anti-slavery activist, by the way, but also he was a very prominent reformer. He translated his Reform prayer book into German, not into English. And another rabbi who was more conservative on the making changes front, but more of a genius when it came to organizational structures and in marketing, Isaac Mayer Wise, also made a Reform version of a prayer book, but he translated his into English. And he called it Minhag America, the customs of America. He even put the Star-Spangled Banner in the back of the prayer book as a sign of this is our home, this is our Jerusalem, but he put it in English because that was how to get the future generation. And ultimately his prayer book became one of the templates for the American organized reform movement, which he helped to organize in the 1870s and 80s into the early 2000s. And one of the pinnacles of that organization process was the issuance of a declaration that was called the Pittsburgh Platform. You can, by the way, here, Pittsburgh, you wouldn't think of this as a major Jewish city, but for German Jews who are on those port cities, it's called Three Rivers because there are three rivers coming in to Pittsburgh. And so it's a major hub of that kind of water trade. And I want to show you just some of the radical statements, but also the American inflected statements of the Pittsburgh Platform as issued in 1885, which demonstrates this. There are still certainly very Jewish areas in Pittsburgh, but it's not one of the first cities that comes to mind when one thinks of Jewish American cities. So here's the text issued in 1885. Isaac Mayer Wise was the presiding rabbi, but the real drivers were younger, more radical rabbis named Emil Hirsch and Kaufman Kohler, who, by the way, in the small world of Jewish life, were both sons-in-law of David Einhorn, the radical rabbi who made the German translation. Two of his sons-in-law became radical reform rabbis as well. Wise was the presider, but this was more radical than he might have done on his own. So number one, we recognize in every religion an attempt to grasp the infinite. In every mode, source, or book of revelation held sacred in any religious system, the consciousness of the indwelling of God in man. We hold that Judaism presents the highest conception of the God idea as taught in our holy scriptures and developed and spiritualized with Jewish teachers in accordance with the moral and philosophical progress of their respective ages. We maintain that Judaism preserved and defended amidst continual struggles and trials under enforced isolation, this God idea as the central religious truth for the human race. So notice the interfaith dialogue that's going on in the very first sentence. Every religion is an attempt to grasp the infinite. every mode source book of Revelation held sacred in any religious system has a common idea of the indwelling of God in man. So right at the outset, they're saying we're different from the other religions, but we're on the same team. You wouldn't have heard this in Europe. That was not the dominant style of interfaith dialogue in Europe. But this is definitely the case of a more tolerant, no established religion context in America. You see some of the more radical statements about the Bible where they say that the Bible reflects the primitive ideas of its own age. Well, that's, again, calling the Bible primitive is somewhat radical. But notice, by the way, they don't say Torah. It's the Bible, because that's what they have. That's a term they have in common, even if the content is somewhat different. And notice what they say about the rules in that Bible. The Mosaic legislation trained the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine. And today, we accept as binding only the moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. So if modern civilization says we should pray with our heads uncovered, you take off your hat going into a holy space, that's what you do. If modern civilization says that a pipe organ is what inspires people, then by golly, we can put a pipe organ and a mixed gender choir with non-Jewish people singing in our temples. And we don't have to follow the ritual laws that separate us from everybody else, because that was when we were a nation in Palestine. We're not there anymore. We only accept the ones that inspire us, that elevate us. This is defining Jewishness as a religion because it's based on what inspires the individual, not the ritual practices of a separate clannish community. And if there's a conflict between what your inherited Jewish tradition and modern civilization, you can see modernity wins. And they explicitly say all the Mosaic laws about diet, purity, and dress are under the influences of ideas entirely foreign to our mental and spiritual state. They obstruct rather than further modern spiritual elevation. Number 5 is really the kicker. We recognize in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect, the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for, not the Messiah, son of David, not the kingdom of Israel, for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. I mean, it's funny. It almost sounds like truth, justice in the American way, right? And here's the key line. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron or any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. So we are just religion. We are Americans by nationality, and we are Jewish by religion. Just like you have Catholic Americans, you have Protestant Americans, we are the Jewish Americans. The American is the noun, the Jewish is the adjective. There's also some nods to Christianity and Islam being daughter religions of Judaism. We appreciate their providential mission to aid in spreading monotheistic and moral truth. The spirit of broad humanity in our age is our ally, and we extend the hand of fellowship to cooperate in the establishment of the reign of truth and righteousness among men. Again, this is interfaith dialogue, this is tolerance. And similarly, in the model of the era of the dawning progressive era, a commitment to dealing with relations between rich and poor, and ultimately establishing on the basis of justice and righteousness a much better solution than the current evils of the present organization of society. So here you have a quintessentially American religious document, because it is clearly emphasizing what Jews have in common with their neighbors. It's also celebrating the changes in American Jewish life and the opportunities that are opened to become fully American by leaving behind those things that separate you from the surrounding cultures and peoples. Now, the historical irony is the American Jewish establishment was German Jews, was Reform Jews when this was issued in 1885. But the next flood of immigrants had already started. It was the flood that would last from the 1880s until the 1920s. And this was the huge flood of Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jews from the eastern parts of Hungary, where they still spoke Yiddish and not standard German, from Eastern Poland, from the Russian Empire, from Romania and the other Balkan states. There were some non-Yiddish-speaking Jews that came in this period. For example, my father's family, which came from Syria, they came in the 1920s. In fact, my father's father, I found out just recently, came over on the Lusitania. in 1911, 1912, something like that, which is obviously before it was sunk during World War I. Good luck on that front. And there were some Sephardi Jews as well, Jews from Salonika, for example, after a massive fire and destruction there in the 19-teens. Some of them left and some of them wound up in the United States and founded the Sephardic Jewish community of Jews from Salonika from that period. But the vast majority of Jews coming in were Eastern European Jews. The population rose tremendously in Eastern Europe, and there were millions of surplus Jews who couldn't make a living there, and they left. They didn't leave there because it was so good. They left there because it was terrible, and they hoped for better in America. And what you have is, I mentioned we had about 250,000 Jews by the 1870s. Let's say by the 1880s, it was up to 400,000 with the beginning of this wave. By 1920, there were 4 million American Jews. And the vast majority of them, again, this is a tenfold increase. The vast majority of them have their roots in Eastern Europe. About 5/6 of them claim their roots in Eastern Europe. They speak Yiddish as their daily language. They might use Hebrew as a ritual language. And they actually fall along a spectrum of religious behavior and belief, because some of them are Orthodox Jews. Some of them are radical socialists and secularists. The founding of the Workmen's Circle happens in this period, which is a version of the Jewish Labor Bund. Jewish unions are formed as well. You have communist Jews, you have socialist Jews, you have simply unaffiliated Jews. Most Jews weren't affiliated with a synagogue in the 1920s and 30s because they were living in these densely Jewish neighborhoods. And who needed to be affiliated to feel Jewish? You spoke Yiddish, you read a Yiddish newspaper, you ate Jewish food, you lived with Jewish neighbors, your kids went to schools that were 90% Jewish, that closed on Jewish holidays because there was nobody there. My mother went to high school and graduated in the 1950s. And her high school was probably 60 to 70% Jewish. And my rabbi growing up, Sherwin Wine, went to a high school in Detroit in the 1930s. His school was 90% Jewish because the neighborhood was 90% Jewish. You would have Zionists, you would have anti-Zionists, you would have conservative and Orthodox and Reform Jews all living in the same area and all arguing with each other. You had radical socialist Jews showing up at the synagogue steps on Yom Kippur to smoke a cigar and eat a ham and cheese sandwich in front of everybody just to stick it to this was the dynamic of this vibrant and interactive, diverse Jewish community. And again, there's no rabbi who can excommunicate this heretic Jew out there. They can be as Jewish as they want to be, how they want to be. And actually, I would argue that by eating the ham and cheese sandwich specifically on Yom Kippur, specifically in front of the synagogue, that was also a Jewish activity in its willful negation of traditional Jewish practice. So we have many of these Jews coming in, do not have language skills to get higher learning, even if they are literate, by the way. They're often literate in Yiddish or Russian, but that doesn't help them in America. Many of them do wind up in these factory jobs, specifically the garment industry, which ironically is sometimes owned by German Jews employing Eastern European Jews. There's a wonderful short story called A Union for Shabbos, which is about a group of Jewish workers who have to organize to get Saturdays off from their Jewish boss. But because the Jewish boss is a Reform Jew, he doesn't care about working on Saturday. And he goes to his services on Sunday morning. But the Jewish workers do care, and they have to lobby to make the change. There are certainly a lot of conflicts between the German Jewish establishment and these Eastern European Jewish immigrants, whether they're radical socialists who are going to undermine the capitalist success of the German Jewish entrepreneurs, or they are Orthodox and wear these long hats and long beards and payas and dress funny and aren't assimilated to America. So what winds up happening is there's a series of efforts made by the German Jewish establishment to civilize what they called their co-religionists, which I find a hilarious usage, because if you define religion by belief or practice, they have nothing in common, because the German Jews are eating ham and are not attending services and are working on Saturdays. And the Orthodox Jews believe that God wrote the Torah and would never call the Bible primitive. They're co-religionists? Well, okay. But it's part of that framing of American Judaism as religion that the German Jewish establishment is trying to impose. Nevertheless, there are a whole series of initiatives started. There's a program called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which tries to, again, welcome them in, get them jobs, take them to night classes to show them how to cook and how to dress and how to learn English. There's the Hebrew Free Loan Society, which allows them to start their own businesses. And there's even the sponsoring of a conservative movement that's somewhere between Orthodox and Reform. Now, the conservative movement actually starts in America shortly before the Pittsburgh Platform, because there's a graduation of the first rabbis trained by Isaac Mayer Wise in Cincinnati. But at the reception after the graduation, to which he'd invited leaders and rabbis from all over the American Jewish world, and it had gone pretty well, at the reception, they served shrimp. And by the way, not just shrimp, but also frog legs and oysters. And I know this because the American Jewish History Museum in Philadelphia has a copy of the menu from that event. So you can see how obnoxious it was to kosher sensibilities. And so some rabbis stormed out in a huff and said, forget it, this is too far. And they founded the Jewish Theological Seminary as a contrary approach, a more conservative approach to the Reform Hebrew Union College, which did not call itself Reform because it was seen as just American. But the conservatives said this is too far. But the JTS floundered for a long time until in the early 1900s, they had two big successes. One is they brought in a new scholar from Cambridge University, whose name was Solomon Schechter, who instantly raised the prestige and later on would grant his name to a franchise of day schools. No, they're just named after him. It's not a franchise model. But the other big stroke was a number of Reform Jews saw all these unwashed migrants of their co-religionists coming in who were all backward traditionalists and needed to be modernized. And so they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to sponsor this Jewish Theological Seminary, which will train traditionally inclined rabbis who can speak good English, who have graduate degrees, and who can go into traditional synagogues and move them along and modernize them. And it actually worked. So after a couple generations, you had the conservative movement as the largest denominational movement in America. You went back to the 50s and 60s, something like 35, 40% of synagogues or higher were conservative. And Reform was more like 20%, 25%. Now, the Reform movement is larger for factors we'll talk about. But in that period, when those Eastern European Jews were joining conservative synagogues as their model of making it in America, and not joining the Reform synagogues that they considered to be like churches with the pipe organs and the women singers and all that, and people not wearing hats and no taluses, and that was just foreign ridiculousness. It was a middle ground, and it did serve that middle ground and was very successful. Now, I will also point out that Orthodox Judaism really gets deep roots in America from this wave too, right? You have the founding of the first establishment Orthodox Rabbinic Seminary in the 1920s in New York. And that leads to the growth of a modern Orthodox style Judaism. Ultra-Orthodox or Hasidic Judaism didn't really take root in America until after World War II with post-Holocaust refugees, because this was the Treifa Medina. This was the unkosher land for Hasidic Jews, where it was the golden Medina. It was the golden land for those Jews who were more secularized and looking for opportunity. You do also get in this 1880s period the rising of anti-Semitic attitudes in America, the exclusion of Jews from resorts and country clubs, but also the exclusion of Jews from professional jobs. In fact, in many areas, Jews had to found their own hospitals because Jewish doctors wouldn't be employed by the main hospital, certainly not by Catholic hospitals. And the same is true for law firms, accounting firms, and other cases like that. Nowadays, it's not as much of a concern, but you'll sometimes see Jews Hospital or Hebrew Memorial Hospital or Beth Israel Hospital. Well, one of the reasons they have Jewish names on them is because they were founded by the Jewish community to serve Jews, but also to employ Jewish doctors. But again, you never get an anti-Semitic party that gains a really strong foothold in Congress, for example, as part of its platform to exclude or expel Jews. That's seen as beyond the pale, to make a historical pun. But you do certainly get anti-Semitic politicians who say terrible things in the halls of Congress. That attitude is widespread and not to be dismissed. But you have very limited, anti-Jewish riots or pogroms. There are a few lynchings here and there. There's one blood libel accusation in upstate New York in the 1840s or so, but very, very rare and few and far between. But there are, there are plenty of stories of people growing up in the 10s, 20s, 30s, Jewish kids trying to get to public school and having to run to not get beaten up by the bullies. I mean, that happened, and they were being beaten up because they were Jewish. Now, the Jewish community has another phase change in the 1930s. And that is in the 1920s, after World War I, you have a closing of the doors of immigration. First with laws passed in 1919 and then more strictly in 1924. And with the close of immigration, now Jewish community begins to shift because everybody's a citizen or has been a citizen for a while by the 1950s. Not everybody. There are still a few immigrants coming in. There are Hitler refugees making their way in, people sort of taking backdoor immigration routes through Canada or Mexico. By the way, there are American Jews who found their way to America by crossing the Rio Grande. They snuck in just like people may be trying to sneak in even today. So when people try to say, well, all of our immigrants came in illegally, well, not necessarily. In any case, the closing of the gates, though, did cut off that huge flood to a trickle. And that meant that now Jews living in America didn't have a new flow of Yiddish-speaking immigrants coming in. So those Yiddish-focused shulas and educational programs that secular Jews were running became harder to staff because you didn't have native Yiddish speakers coming in all the time. And after 20 or 30 years of living in America, the parents didn't necessarily need it, and the kids didn't necessarily want it. They wanted to be American, just American. Hyphenated Americanism and multiculturalism is not going to show up for another 20, 30 years. So the desire is for Jews to integrate, to acculturate, to become part of America. There are some further Eastern European flows that come in after the Holocaust, after 1945, that gives a kind of Yiddish renaissance to that part of American Jewish life. But the challenge, particularly for those secular Jewish alternatives of the Workman's Circle and the Sholem Aleichem schools and the Farband labor Zionist schools, is that there's a number of headwinds now they're now facing after World War II. Jewish upward mobility. You know, when you're a worker in a factory, socialism sounds great. When you're a lawyer with your own house in the suburbs and 2 cars in your attached garage, a revolution where the haves and the have-nots switch places doesn't sound so good because you're a have now. You know, you're in a very different position in life. You may still have liberal sympathies. You may still vote for the Democratic Party, as most American Jews do, even today. But socialism maybe is a stretch too far, particularly, of course, in the 1950s with the McCarthy era, where you don't want to be anything to the left of the Democrats. So if you were a socialist or, heaven forbid, a communist, your job could be, you could be fired, you could be have your business boycotted. It was really dangerous. And so because secular Jewish alternatives had hitched their wagon to leftist politics, when leftist politics were out of fashion, that became a real challenge. They were also generally urban-based, and American Jews were moving to the suburbs when they could. You know, Levittown is just one example that where Jews could move and African Americans could not, as we've talked about. Honestly, the founding of the state of Israel also was a challenge because now Zionism and remembering the Holocaust became the 2 pillars of American Jewish life. The Holocaust more so later in the 70s, but supporting Israel was almost doctrinaire in that earlier period. And Israel was Hebrew. Israel was, you know, Hebrew language music and Jewish folk dancing and being proud of our boys who fought back. And so the challenge was that Yiddish was a tough sell in an era when Hebrew was ascendant. So, I mean, they even tried to change how you pronounce the Hebrew in a lot of synagogues to follow the Israeli model instead of the Ashkenazi model. So instead of Yiskadal v'Yiskadash Shemei Rabbah for the Kaddish, you would say Yitkadal v'Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah, which is how it's pronounced in Mizrahi Sephardi style Hebrew in Israel. Even American Jewish congregations began to imitate that because it was part of the shift away from Yiddish and towards pro-Israeli identity. Now, the last phase I want to talk about in a little bit of depth, and I want to show you some statistics about American Judaism as well to give you a picture of where we are now, took place from the 1970s to the 1990s. Because in that window, you don't get a lot of Eastern European Jews coming in. They're still captive under the new Russian Empire, aka the Soviet Union, although there are some tens of thousands who make their way over in the 1970s, and then some hundreds of thousands who make their way over in the 1990s once the Soviet Union falls. There's also large numbers of Israelis who wind up in America, which was an unpredicted phenomenon from a Zionist perspective. The thought was, we start Israel, everybody moves here, the end. But what turns out is there are opportunities outside of Israel. Israel is full of conflict and stress, and there's an Orthodox establishment there because they followed the European model of a chief rabbinate. Well, So now some Israelis wind up leaving, and eventually tens of thousands of Israelis leave Israel and find their way to America. They often aim for similar climates they're used to. So they might wind up in Miami or in Los Angeles. There are large numbers of Israeli Jews in New York. There's also substantial numbers in Chicago, Milwaukee, and some other areas as well. And they bring their own particular experience because they've lived an ethnic Jewish identity. They're largely secularized in their practice, living in Israel. They do Passover as a home holiday. Hanukkah is a home holiday. Who needs to go to a synagogue? The synagogue I don't go to is Orthodox, they might say, but they don't go to a synagogue at all. If they go to an Orthodox one because that's the traditional stuff they don't do anyways. There were also large numbers of Persian Jews who came from Iran after the fall of the Shah in the late 70s. So there's these different waves of diverse Jewish communities that set up camp in different parts of the country. And as I mentioned, the migration to the South and the West accelerates in the 1970s to the 1990s. This is also the period of the so-called return to tradition, where some Jews become more religious. As we'll see, though, it's not as large a phenomenon as some people think. This is a period of Jewish feminism, where Jewish women look at the feminist movement happening in the broader society in the 60s and 70s and say, why am I fighting for the right to admission to an elite law school out there in the world, and I don't even count as a prayer minion in my synagogue? I can't be a synagogue president. I can't be a rabbi. What is that all about? So the first American Reform rabbi ordained who's a woman is Sally Priesand in 1972. The first conservative rabbi ordained who's a woman is Amy Eilberg in 1986. So things begin to change as a response to the feminist movement happening outside in American Jewish life. And of course, intermarriage also begins to rise in this period, in part because of the breaking down of those barriers. If you're not speaking Yiddish at home, if you're not living in a dense Jewish community, if you're doing professions that are not defined by Jewish orbits, then again, intermarriage is a natural result of living in an open society. And so, one comment in the box mentions the idea of the Rebbitzin, the rabbi's wife, taking a more important role in the synagogue. And, well, why be a rabbi when one can be a Rebbitzin? Because being the doctor's wife is not the same as being the doctor. And a lot of women decided that they wanted to be the doctor, not just the doctor's wife. And the same is true for rabbis, too. Now, one of the other important questions is how the Jewish community responded to intermarriage. And here's an example of a survey done in the year 2000. And you can see by the way the questions are worded what the Jewish establishment thought and what people on the ground thought. So this was a study done in the year 2000. Think about how you might have answered these questions, okay? This is done by the American Jewish Committee, which is a very establishment organization going back to the German Jewish period of the 1910s and 20s. Which is a greater threat to Jewish life in the United States today, intermarriage or anti-Semitism? Now, the fact they even asked that question, which is a greater threat, marrying for love or people who want to kill you, but they see them on a par, right, as a threat. And it's about split 50-50, though anti-Semitism is more so, and some say both equally. Tell me if you agree or disagree with the following. It would pain me if my child married a Gentile. Notice 40% agreed, but 56% disagreed. Intermarriage is inevitable in an open society. 80% agreed. The best response to intermarriage is encourage the Gentile to convert to Judaism. 68% disagreed. The Jewish community has an obligation to reach out to intermarried couples. 81% said yes. It's racist to oppose Jewish Gentile intermarriages. 50% of that, they're sort of torn on that one, but still 50% disagree. 47% disagree. And finally, the Jewish community has an obligation to urge Jews to marry Jews. Well, 69% say yes. Which of the following agrees with your view? I'm neutral is 40%. I see marriage between Jews and Gentiles as a positive good, 16%. Are you kidding me? Now, this is the best one to show the split between the establishment and the people out there. Rabbinic officiation at a mixed marriage is a controversial issue. Which is closest to your own view? Rabbi should refuse to officiate at any marriage between a Jew and a Gentile. 22%. So 1/5 of American Jews say yes. Rabbi should say no way. Rabbi should officiate only if no Gentile clergyman is involved. 16%. Rabbi should officiate even with a Gentile clergyman involved. 57%. said yes. Do you know what percent of rabbis in the year 2000 would have said yes? Much, much smaller. In fact, the conservative rabbinate forbids its rabbis from officiating or co-officiating marriages. Of course, the Orthodox rabbinate forbids it as well. And the Reform rabbinate has a policy on the book saying we don't support it. It's a bad thing to do. There's no consequence if you do it, but it's a bad thing to do. And today they estimate about half of Reform rabbis today would officiate in an intermarriage. Now, to our credit in humanistic Judaism, our rabbis have officiated at them going back into the 70s. We were sometimes some of the only rabbis who would do them. And we had, some of our career rabbis had 3,000, 4,000 weddings they did because they were some of the only rabbis in the area who were willing to officiate in intermarriages. But notice the population, the people out there wanted rabbis to do it. Now, what's even more funny about this survey, which was done in the year 2000, is if you find it on the American Jewish Committee website, and this was into the 20 teens, I haven't checked in the last couple of years, but this is how it used to look. Look at what they did to the data. It's all jumbled. So it's almost impossible to read. And same thing with the rabbinic, because they don't want anybody quoting the data. It's so controversial, they can't even present it honestly on their website. But no matter the disapproval, the numbers were going up. Before 1970, 13% of Jews intermarried. Began to rise in the 70s. By the 80s, it was 38%. By the 90s, it was in the 40s. And by the end of the 90s, it was close to 50%, which is where it remains today. That's going to change what it means to be Jewish. And it's going to change how we understand that concept of Jewishness in America. So the last set of stats I want to give you, and I know I've talked a lot for one of these classes, and we still have our discussion questions too, is to look at the varieties of Jewishness today as demonstrated by opinion surveys. There was a wonderful study done in 2013 by the Pew Forum on Religion and American Life called A Portrait of Jewish Americans. My understanding is they're doing a revised version based on questions asked in the year 2000. It hasn't come out yet. Hopefully it will. That'll be really interesting to look at. But I have some data from the 2013 study. You know what, Ren, you say it's not on purpose. It's the only data on any of the studies that looks like that. Even in that same study, everything else is perfect, and that one section is garbled. So I'm willing to believe this conspiracy theory. Okay, so now we have a very interesting phenomenon depicted in this study by people who call themselves Jews of no religion. That means when they ask, what religion are you? And they say, I'm not religious. Well, do you consider yourself Jewish in some other way? Yes, that's that 22%. And also notice how that shifted generationally. So the oldest generation they surveyed, born 1914 to 1927, almost all of them said they were Jewish by religion. That's following, remember, that Reform Jewish model. But millennials born after 1980, a third of the millennials said that they were Jewish, but not religious. And so the overall number is 22% among all generations. Similar kinds of questions that we like, but others might not like the answers to. Being Jewish is more about culture and ancestry than religion. They ask, what is Jewish mainly a matter of? Is it ancestry, culture, religion, or combination? Notice of all Jews, 62% said it's mainly ancestry and culture. Only 15% said it's mainly about religion, and 23% said it's a mix. Of course, Jews of no religion are more likely to say ancestry and culture, but even Jews by religion, over half of them said being Jewish is mainly ancestry and culture, not religion. How are kids being raised? This is the $64,000 question. Well, if you are a Jew by religion, 71% of them are raising their kids as Jewish by religion, but 15% are raising them partly Jewish by religion, and 7% are raising them not religiously Jewish at all, or a mix, but some kind of Jewish. And 7% are not even bothering to raise them Jewish at all. Now, Jews of no religion, the numbers are much higher as not raising them Jewish. But notice the intermarriage question too. Of those married to a non-Jewish spouse, 20% are raising them Jewish by religion, 25% partly, 16% culturally Jewish or a mix, and 37% not Jewish. This is actually a wonderful improvement over studies done in the year 2000 or the year 1990. or 1980. In those years, you would have 10% of the children of intermarriage being raised in any variety of Jewish, and now it's over 60% if you add up the 20, the 25, and the 16. That's progress, because now we have many more rabbis willing to officiate at marriages, many more communities willing to accept the children of Jewish men as Jewish, not just Jewish women, and many more communities willing to accept intermarried families as members in their communities. And so the results are in the pudding. We're doing a much better job of retention of Jews who have married someone not Jewish because we've changed our response. They used to say that intermarriage was the threat to American Judaism. Remember that question? It's the response to intermarriage, in my opinion, that's the threat. Here again, you see the breakdown of intermarriage by year, as demonstrated by the survey. Here's the breakdown of American Jewish denominational identity. Again, I mentioned the conservative movement used to be the largest. Now it's much decreased. Now Reform is the largest. That big body of Jews migrated through the conservative movement. The Orthodox represent 10% in this survey. And people always say, well, they have so many kids, they're going to grow. But in 2000, they were about 10%. In 1990, they were about 9%. So we'll see why the Orthodox world is not growing as fast as people think it is. And actually, the second largest breakdown is the no denomination, the just Jews. They should count as the second largest denomination. When you jump down to this, it describes denominational switching. That is, if you were raised Orthodox, what are you today? Well, 48% of those raised Orthodox are currently Orthodox. But notice, over half of the Jews raised Orthodox are not Orthodox today. That's one of the reasons why the numbers haven't grown as fast as people predicted. You'll notice many conservative Jews, some of them became more Orthodox, but many of them became more liberal. 30% became Reform, and large numbers beyond that went even more liberal than that. And for Reform Jews, again, a small percentage became Orthodox, some became conservative, but the vast majority of them actually stayed central or stayed where they were or became more secularized. So this is one of those interesting phenomena that demonstrates how Jewishness is not just the popular story of Jews becoming more religious. In fact, many Jews are becoming more secular. When they asked American Jews, what does it mean to be Jewish? Look at the numbers here. Remembering the Holocaust is number one, 73%. Caring about Israel is way down, 43%. Having a good sense of humor is almost tied with caring about Israel. And leading a moral life and working for justice trounce being part of a Jewish community. Only 28% said being part of a Jewish community is essential to being Jewish to them. And only 19% said observing Jewish law, and only 14% said eating traditional Jewish foods. So they've even asked the question, what's compatible with being Jewish? Can you work on the Sabbath and be Jewish? Well, a large majority can accept that. It might be a bad Jew, but they would still accept you as being Jewish. Can you be strongly critical of Israel? Well, again, 89% say yes. Can you not believe in God and be Jewish? 68% said, yes, that's not a problem. Interestingly, 34% said, yes, you could be Jewish and believe Jesus was the Messiah. Because remember, if Jewishness is ancestry, well, then you're Jewish by ancestry, even if you believe Jesus was the Messiah. Some other interesting phenomena. Jews from the former Soviet Union account for roughly 1/10 of the American Jewish population. So it is a substantial portion who've come or have their roots in families that came in the last 40 years or so, since the 1970s. Jews have very high educational attainment. 58% are college graduates, compared to 29% of US adults who graduated from college. And 28% of Jews have a postgraduate degree, compared to 10% of the general population. 1/4 of Jews have a household income exceeding $150,000, compared with 8% in the public as a whole. Again, much more affluent. Only 40% say they live in a household where one person's a member of a synagogue. So that's bad news for synagogue workers. Jews are heavily concentrated. 43% now live in the Northeast, compared to 18% of the public. And half of Jews, 49% live in urban areas, 47% live in the suburbs, just 4% of Jews reside in rural areas. And the American Jewish population is very different, with a much higher percentage, again, not over 50%, but a higher percentage living in rural areas. And then notice you get the traditional Jewish democratic lean, and that's not a surprise. Although notice Orthodox Jews split differently, and that's accelerated only in the last several years. So as I said, there's so much more you can explore about the American Jewish experience. This is what we can do in the time that we have.